Right, good evening, everyone. Let's go ahead and make a start. Hello, and welcome to this second of 3 plenary lectures as part of the conference on Utopia and the Return of History. Protecting imaginary societies, even enacting them, is a way of thinking that intensifies during periods of rapid change and attendant cultural disorientation. As such, utopianism has imagined radical alternatives to capitalism and colonialism. This conference is exploring the role of contemporary utopias in helping humanity understand and respond to the climate crisis and its associated crises of pandemics, wars over resources, mass forced migration, and failures of governance. And with this theme in mind, it's a tremendous pleasure to welcome this evening's speaker, Professor Joy James. Joy James is Ebenezer Fitch Professor of Humanities at Williams College. She's the author of Resisting State Violence, Radicalism, Gender, and Race in U.S. Culture, Shadowboxing, Representations of Black Feminist Politics, Transcending the Talented Tenth, Black Leaders and American Intellectuals, and Seeking the Beloved Community, a Feminist Race Reader. She's also the editor of The New Abolitionists, Neo-Slave Narratives and Contemporary Prison Writings. Imprisoned Intellectuals, America's Political Prisoners Write About Life, Liberation, and Rebellion, Warfare in the American Homeland, Policing in Prison and a Penal Democracy, The Angela Y. Davis Reader, and co-editor of the Black Feminist Reader. Professor James's most recent books include In Pursuit of Revolutionary Love, Precarity, Power, Communities, and New Bones Abolition, Captive Maternal Agency, and The Afterlife of Erica Garner. A central thread that draws together Professor James's prolific writing is her commitment to radical and revolutionary Black feminist theory, which she frames not as a detached body of academic thought, but an embodied form of writing and thinking that is inextricably bound up with the project of liberation. She writes that to grapple with such phenomena requires sanctuary and vision. Suffering produces the conditions under which sanctuaries are imagined and constructed within minds, at times extended into the physical world. One clear example of this commitment is Professor James's creation of the Harriet Tubman Literary Circle, a digital repository, educational clearinghouse, and advocacy project that creates and promotes online archives of information, art, narratives, and maps that support the expansion of sustainable communities and anti-violence initiatives. Professor James's writing has contributed significantly to my own thinking, particularly her framing of Western theory or womb theory, her critique of Aristotle's fracturing of humanity, and her engagement with time and temporality. Equally illuminating has been her concept of captive maternals, whom she frames as those who are feminized into caretaking and consumption, and who, in her words, are those most vulnerable to violence, war, poverty, police, and captivity. They are those whose very existence enables the possessive empire that claims and dispossesses them. The title of Professor James's talk today is Caretakers, Compradors, and Captive Maternals as Vanguard. I'm looking forward to learning more about where she'll take this concept next. There will be time for discussion after the lecture, so please do make a note of your questions. I should mention that this lecture is being recorded and will be shared afterwards, so just make note of that as you ask your questions. And please join me now in welcoming Professor Joy James.
Thank you. Good evening. I'm grateful to be here, so thank you to the University of Manchester, to Megan and everyone who's brought this gathering together. I've appreciated being able to sit on to whatever preposition this is, but to be part of your own, collectives and your panels, and to hear the queries go back and forth. So I'm very much interested in your ideas and concepts, and also pushback against this notion that we've been developing over the last, I think from 2016, when I first wrote The Womb of Western Theory, when I was asked to write a piece in a volume on Foucault on carceral notebooks, and Foucault's work on the GIP, right? What that became was not a focus on Foucault, who I have a critique of as well, but it also became how do we talk about care and struggle, but not always within the register of emotionality or within a familial context, but as a political project that could absolutely and adequately confront an empire. So it's a high bar to jump, but it's worthy of the endeavor. So I want to start with maybe defining some of the terms that are up on the screen. So the captive maternal, as I said, it's a concept that I've been working on for a while, and graduate students were very helpful in helping me develop it. They also have a critique. They think I'm not radical enough. I guess that's the thing about the youth, and I was young before, so I understand the impulse, right? But what I'm trying to think about is how we function. So the captive maternal is not a gender, it is a function. So where I've written about it in Scalawag or the American Philosophical Association blog or other sites, it is about how we act in the world when we understand ourselves to be betrayed by the world, right? That there's a lineage, especially in the United States, of political repression, of racial denigration, of being targeted for incarceration, if not targeted for premature and violent death. So what it means to caretake in a world that is shaped by dispossession and dishonor and is grounded in danger for specific populations, this is the first level that I talk about, the caretaking. And it can be very private, very intimate, how you care for your partner, your children, your elders. It also can move to the protest level, from that level to the movement. And as I said before, we've seen this in our movements to try to get legal rights, civil rights, human rights in our own states. 2020 with George Floyd would have been the most massive output in terms of mobilization. But for me, the caretaking, the protests, the movement are insufficient. As you know, our movements went up to a high register and then they scaled back down, or at least that's the case in the United States. And in the United States, the police now, after all those protests, they kill more civilians than they had before the protests, and more money is given to the police than it received before. So there's a way, and hopefully I'll be able to get to cop cities and militarized policing. There's a way now in the United States that policing has to become a militarized project. So the New York Police Department, NYPD, the Atlanta Police Department, they train with the IDF. The understanding now that the citizens are to be contained, and our capacity to speak and protest, even the students at elite universities like Columbia, Yale, Harvard, are being threatened for free speech. And there have been arrests in a number of sites, right? So caretaking, protest, movement, what happens after the movement scales down? There's a possibility that a segment of people are willing to go forward. And this I would identify as a vanguard. And I know sometimes it can considered to be an elite formation, but I also think there's a possibility that it's a gathering of discipline and political will, which I call agape. So I was trained in seminary by James Cone and Cornell West, so liberation theology has been very important to me. I'm not always a good practitioner of compassion and community building, but I understand the value of agape love and discipline. The people who go forward as vanguard, those are the people who go into marronage. And so marronage is the autonomy from the state. It's the autonomy from the nonprofit that is funding you to be a good citizen and have agency, but aligned with the state. People who go into marronage are taking risk. And so in the past, when you talked about the books that I anthologized, when I went to Brown University, I anthologized Political Prisoners. I think there were 4 volumes. And it was one of the reasons that I needed to leave, because it was not seen as appropriate 20 years ago. But then recently, Brown purchased Mumia Abu-Jamal's papers. And the revenue from that purchase did not go to Mumia. I think you're familiar with who Mumia is, right? The revenues went to middle-class people who could broker that deal, right? And so now it's fashionable to embrace political prisoners, at least in text, at least to capture the image, at least to have their scores, the musical scores that they developed, that students performed, all that becomes an archive. And an archive is not a maroon camp. An archive is a collection particularly by, those who have the money to collect, which means entities that are Ivy. And I'm riffing, I could be reading, and you're like, go read your paper, I will in a minute. So what happens in the United States, to go back to the Panthers, who, part of my extended family includes one at least, the people who took the most risk also disappeared in some ways and would not be recognized as caretakers, as protesters or movement makers, or even those who became the architects of Marronage or maroon camps. But what happened in the United States is that our struggles themselves became purchased. And for me as an academic and having been in the game for decades, a good part of the purchase came from the elite academy. And so now you can have the image of the rebel. Mumia is in for 44 years. And last year, it was revealed that the district attorney had hidden from the past, like from the 80s, 12,000 pages that would have exonerated him. And all the witnesses that said that he had shot a police officer had recanted. So instead of having an elderly white male judge preside over the hearing for a new trial, they chose a black woman. And that would be the Comprador. So if you put a black female face on something in the US, it's perceived to be a good luck, but it has the same predatory desire as the state. So Linda Thomas Greenfield is the representative to the UN, and as a black woman, she's continuously vetoed the ceasefire in Palestine. So what I'm saying, it may sound like a swirl, but there are these moving pieces. I align with the Vanguard, but the Vanguard's narrative that narrative, or narratives in the plural, have been co-opted by elite academy. And so what happens is that our own struggle is sold back to us. And this is why I think the captive maternal is very important, but there has to be discernment about what stage we're on. And if the projection is that we are actually radical when we are not, that means that we're no longer in play. And again, maybe this comes up in Q&A, I would say that some of our beloved icons have said that we are radical when we're not. And so there's no need to pursue any other kind of politics other than vote Democrat, which this time we'll be voting for Biden, and the youth call him Genocide Joe. So the lesser of two evils, do you want Trump, as proto-fascist, or do you want a Democratic Party elected official who will also send, military hardware and reportedly AI or killer bots in order to test, the equipment that's developed mostly by US defense companies and corporations who are making a ton of money off of this? This is our swirl. So if we go from caring about ending a war to protesting about a genocidal war to movement and, going forward, the encampments, if we don't move to the next level of autonomy from the state, autonomy from the nonprofit, autonomy from academia, there is no way that we reach the moment of Marronage, where we understand what an engaged struggle is as opposed to a performative display of struggle. Now, what happens when you move to the level of Marronage, in my experience, and also the experience that I've known for 30 years for people who were in the Black Panther Party on the East Coast, which is different from the West Coast. The West Coast in Oakland was more performative, and at one point they sent assassins to kill Panthers on the East Coast who were revolutionary, who were going to go underground. And as Sophia Bukhari said when I brought her to Brown, they were caught between a rock and the hard place. The FBI was going to kill them. They already killed Fred Hampton and Mark Clark in Chicago, December 4, 1969. They tried to kill more Panthers in Southern California on December 11th of the same month. It didn't work out because they had fortified the office with sandbags. But if you're squeezed between the state, lethal power, and you're squeezed between a faction of the left, which actually is not a radical faction, but presents itself as such, to create your marronage would mean to create a fortress. But this is my understanding of fortress and autonomy in the US. If you are efficient, the government will find you. If it cannot neutralize you by buying you, then it will find other ways to disappear you. And for the people that I know, the reason I anthologize these texts over a number of years before I left the university and went to a college, the people that I know have agape on a register that I have never experienced. I have not, and I probably will not risk my life for the idea of freedom and sanctuary. I have not, despite my proximity to people who have, I have not thought beyond the unthinkable to engage in politics that don't have to follow the two-party line of a duopoly. Now, everybody can debate their methods, whether it should be pacifist or whether or not you're allowed to be a militarist. But what I know, which is a register in my mind, and then I'll go back to the screen, we have a roll call of ancestors, which is a roll call of death, which is also an affirmation of life. So if I think in the 1960s, where the people I know were starting to be mobilized as teens, they would probably start with 1961 with Patrice Lumumba and his assassination in the Congo. And the US and the CIA were implicated in that. Then 1963 would be Medgar Evers stepping over the threshold to his home to greet his two young sons and his wife Myrlie Evers being assassinated by a white nationalist. Then 1965, it would be El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, Malcolm X, assassinated in Harlem at the Audubon Ballroom, and currently his daughters are suing the NYPD, the FBI, and the CIA for complicity in his murder. 1968 would be Reverend Martin Luther King. 1969 would be Fred Hampton and Mark Clark, the Chicago Panthers I mentioned. 1973 would be Amilcar Cabral. 1988 would be Dulcie September, who is an ANC activist, and he was in France, and who went to pick up the mail, but there was a mail bomb in the mail. In 1993, I'll stop with, would be Chris Hani, who was assassinated on his front lawn in South Africa, and only a small group of people were supposed to know where he lived, and that would have included the ANC. So we have a tension between, do we want to be liberal, do we want to be radical, can we be faithful, what do we do with the Vanguard who goes underground, do we stay on the epicenter, the surface of politics? How do we have a bungee cord to the people who go to the hypocenter where they'll drill down like Assata Shakur? Not only say, I'll get out of the Panthers because you're trying to kill me, but no, I'll go into the underground because you're trying to kill me. But Assata Shakur also says in her memoir, or writes, they never asked Black people as communities if we wanted an army. And I believe if the revolutionaries had polled us, the answer would be no. We are oppressed, we are not inherently radical. But the transition to these stages inevitably will point to radicalism, because there's nothing about liberalism that could save us. This is what we're trying to do in text, but also to keep memory, not just the lineage of death and love. I don't see the two as bifurcated. I believe everybody that I named struggled because they loved and they left a legacy. Not that we have to repeat what they did, but obviously nobody wants to go to prison or be disappeared, but activists are continuously doing so regardless. So these are the images that we did around a text that's forthcoming with Pluto, where we talk about the captive maternals, but it's really more of a liberal endeavor to identify the relationship of the indigenous and how they're suppressed in the United States, African Americans or people of African descent, and also Afro-Indigenous people who are not spoken of often. So what I liked about this was the Atlantic reminds me of the beauty of nature, but it also reminds me of war. So war on one continent, war on the water, meaning the Atlantic, and then war on a new continent. And again, I don't see these as severed images or severed time periods. And so my question about the utopia, if there is something like that for us, or the sanctuaries that we increasingly manufacture or create out of the conditions that we inherit, if there's a way in which we align with nature, if we align with ourselves, that we could go forward to what is maybe whatever exists beyond war resistance. This is the opening of, this is the first page of New Bones Abolition, and it's a book that I did recently. Like, I did my academic book, so I got my job, and it's like secure. So it gives me the opportunity. Actually, I was doing what I wanted to write anyway, but now I write more with small leftist presses, and this is Common Notions that's based in Philadelphia. So this, I've so appreciated the art that's been here, like for the, you know, when I'm sitting in and learning from all of you collectively, but the poetry, the way in which people understand that it's almost like a quilt when you stitch them together, like my grandmother did in Mississippi, that you can take shreds of things and piece them together, and it has a function. It can be that of beauty, and it can be that of comfort and keeping you warm. So this is the poem, New Bones. We asked permission from her estate, Lucille Clifton, a Black poet who is probably better known in the US than elsewhere. But a lot of what we talk about in the US is about abolition. And so the title of the book, New Bones Abolition, actually takes its cue and its concepts from this, from what she says about not only how splendid we can be in New Bones, but the understanding that we comprehend the value of life. And then for me, the way I read it, if we need new bones, obviously we've been broken in different ways, and so we're mending. And in that process of mending, we become something else. I mean, our scars stay with us, but being scarred can actually be a site of epistemology and knowledge. This is another image that's in the text, 500s of Black resistance. So I went through the chronology or the narrative of what we lost in terms of ancestors who fought as pacifists and others as militarists, right, or the right to self-defense. This is our history collectively. And again, our caretaking is imperative, and so are the protests and the movements. But often I find, particularly in the academy, we don't talk about the fight or the battle. And I wonder why we're so reticent. Because most of us won't go onto the battlefield, but we don't even want to remember the fact that there were battles. And again, if you listen closely to the re-narrating of the civil rights movement, of the Black Power movement, most of it has been sanitized in terms of violence. And in some ways, this is how the state wins. If you don't want to recall what happened to Fred Hampton and Mark Clark, because it's too graphic and it's too 1960s and it doesn't really fit in the trajectory going forward, then what you lose is an understanding about the state's capacity to neutralize what it sees as opposition. The Panthers, according to Kathleen Cleaver, were mostly teenagers. There weren't more than 200 of them. And J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, declared briefly, according to some texts, that the #1 threat to the stability of the United States would be this formation. Black teenagers who were doing food programming, delivery, they were doing educational, they were doing literacy, they also had weapons, because the Black Panther Party originated in Oakland in 1966 with the title, The Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. And why? Because the police, white police officers, shot a 15-year-old black teen when he was running from them. So much of our movements are precipitated by a violent death, but the point would be a longevity in movement. And that's not what I've been seeing or what others I would say would agree with me, have been seen. This is an image inside the book. It's homage to Erica Garner. I was living in Harlem at the time. I did not, I learned, of course, that her father in 2014 was killed by the NYPD, and 2014 was one of those years that kind of blew up. It was Eric Gardner in New York City, Michael Brown in Ferguson, and they left the 18-year-old teen child's body in the street for 4 hours. So it completely unnerved the Black working class community. And that might have been why, when the Ferguson protests happened, people started to burn part of Ferguson, right? And then the last would be with the mother that I worked with, Samaria Rice. Her 12-year-old son, Tamir Rice, was playing with probably a plastic gun, but he was sitting at a pavilion across from a rec center. And the police drove onto the pavilion and shot within a couple of seconds getting out of the car. And his older teenage sister was in the rec center, and she ran out to give aid to her brother, and they tackled her and chained her or handcuffed her into the squad car till the 12-year-old bled out. So people are traumatized, people are enraged. Back to this narrative, Erica Gardner fought for her father. What I wrote about her is not a biography, but again, it's a recognition of her as a captive maternal, whether or not she would call herself that. But it's the function that she played. When she transitioned at the end of, I believe, December 2018, 4 months after giving birth, and there's issues of vulnerability for Black women and children in terms of maternal mortality and infant mortality in the United States, because the medical system doesn't tend to believe the mothers when they say they're in distress. That's how Serena Williams almost died in childbirth with her daughter, and she's a multimillionaire, so it's across class based on the data. It doesn't matter what kind of money you have. If you show up as a pregnant Black woman, your disposability or being rendered unalive increases based on the color of your skin. So the book was a tribute to her, seeing her within the lens of the captive maternal, but also seeing the Compradors' contradictions. These are some of the other images inside the book. The captive maternal is not only ungendered, it has no age. So here you have from the FTP movement, I don't think she's more than 4 years old here, handing out food to unhoused or inadequately fed elder men in the community. So the care can be kicked in on any level by anyone, but to keep the care alive, I'm arguing that at least some faction of our communities has to transfer their agency through all the stages. The second one is when we were in Houston, Texas, in a conference against the death penalty. Texas is just on steroids in terms of all kinds of predatory behavior. But death penalties in the U.S. have been ramped up. And in this garden where we walked out to, you can see the sunflowers that are gorgeous. And then there's a placard for Sundiata Okoli. I believe it's Sundiata, yeah. Who also spent decades in prison as a Black Panther and a Black Panther vet. This is the last image that I want to go to and talk directly and read to you for a bit. This is from this incredible artist that I've never met, and the title is Abduction, and I've been meditating on this probably for a month or two. I mean, the eagle is on our passport. Right? This is the bird of prey. This is the empire. And here's this Black woman in flight with that. And if it is an abduction, can you steer the empire into the right direction? Can you get it to return you to your home? Can you stop it from pecking out your insides? Can you stop it from shrugging or flapping and dropping you to plummet to your death? I mean, there's so many possibilities of struggle here, but there is no certainty of victory. And so for me, then we have to redefine what it means to be a victor or to be victorious. We cannot control an empire. If we could, there would not be 34,000 Palestinians dead. But we can do some things. And so this is one I want to read through the lens of sci-fi Octavia Butler about the capacity of captive maternal love. So I pose a series of questions to myself, like I can't answer them all, but I'm trying. Could the captive maternal and sci-fi or science fiction offer a map for utopia? Through fiction, Octavia Butler was born in 1947 and transitioned in 2006. Butler influences the political landscapes of literature, critical race, and feminist theories. Her writings discussed here in this paper are low-tech, prevalent in science fiction, film, and literature. Human robotic inventions are largely absent in Butler's work. And so this is, I know there's different kinds of sci-fi, and we talked about sci-fi earlier, but what I love about Octavia Butler, and she has a huge following now, and I think Netflix films, which I don't think will do justice to her work, there is an intimacy in her work. Like there's a, like, I know you, you know me, and because her work is radiated out, I can't say that she only wrote for Black people as a Black woman, right? But there's a way in which the presentation of the struggles that I've been talking about reappear in the gaze or in the framework of sci-fi. Most present in her work is what is most missing in American science fiction, the dispossessed Black female protagonist, understood here as a captive maternal. Even though I've said it's ungendered because I've been anthologizing and I've been organizing as a Black feminist for decades, I still see myself as a Black feminist. The captive maternal, in her own right, follows through survival and the flourishing of family, community, and people. The captive maternal is identified by 6 qualities shaped by non-transferable agencies. So I'll be repetitive: care, protest, movement, marronage, war resistance. And now, because of this conference, I'm thinking of Utopia, but I'm naming it as sanctuary, because I don't think there's a permanent resting place for dishonored people, that even if we stay in the States, we're always moving through layers of guilt or layers of retaliation or layers of resistance. Butler offers this embattled, ungendered maternal as the primary agent responsible for stability and sanctuary despite dystopia, slavery, exile, war, and racial sexual violence. This protagonist in speculative fiction that parallels and opposes neo-slavery reflects the subordinate cultures of all worlds. Captivity created the Black matrix, yet the matrix reproduces resistance detrimental to the conditions from which it emerged. Butler's work cannot default into whiteness because of the constant specter of racism. And I think that's what I was trying to ask earlier, if there's 3 worlds. Like technically there were, you know, there's the first world, which is like the Western Empire thing, second world with the Soviet Union from 1917 on, whatever, and the third world. So I didn't organize that, that was a real thing. So if there are 3 tiers, and again, I'm gonna be repetitive because I still have a question around this. If we have the victory in World War II that you defeated Franco and you, well, he lasted longer, right? But you defeated Mussolini and you defeated Nazi, you know, Germany and Hitler. But the world allowed the former colonies to be dragged into these bloody, bloody wars. Why was Fanon in Algeria, right? And I mentioned some of the people, you know, Patrice Lumumba, Amilcar Cabral. What does it mean to have one sector receive a promissory note of progress in sanctuary and another to be condemned as a shooting range because people want, you know, minerals and they want labor? And so in a way, I think that the third world became the forgotten world. And even when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991 with Reagan escalating nuclear weapons, so that probably bankrupt both economies, but the US always manages, you know, to, Yeah, or pimp some other sectors to get more money, right? So I don't hear people address that, and I'm not saying, just because I showed up at the UK for a week or so, we don't address it in the United States. Like when we talk about struggle, we don't recognize that there were three worlds. And because I'm older, I remember it because I was in Moscow or I was in Nairobi, I was doing whatever, and I was with these prominent members of the Communist Party USA who clearly understood that their alliance would be with the Soviets until the Soviets collapsed. Then you only had two other places to go. You either could go to the ground where the poor and the working class, or you could go to the Democratic Party. And the choice was to go where you could have influence and you could leverage without thinking that there is, as my godmother and my madrina told me, you flip the coin, it's got two sides, but it's the same coin. The Democratic Party and the Republican Party both function as imperial antagonists. Barack Obama, who I voted for, was the first black imperial president. It wasn't a freebie. And even the way that he was packaged, it was so that we would be excited about these black faces. He was not a captive maternal, he was a comprador. And so was Condoleezza Rice, and so is the person, in the UN, and so is Lloyd Austin, who is Secretary of State. I'm not sure what we want to see when we look in the mirror, and maybe that's why we have to go to sci-fi, where we have to go where mutations are the norm, and being disfigured is something that's commonplace. And so we're not aliens in sci-fi. That is, I feel, what Octavia Butler opens a portal to, that we can recognize ourselves through mutations and through fiction. But the question is, then once we recognize ourselves, what is the level of agency with that self-recognition? Or do we just stay in a maze of distortion? And in the US, it's a very complicated, I find it to be a very complicated culture. I wasn't born there. I mean, Dad was military, so I was born in Frankfurt, but I was raised there. I was raised on military bases. So there's something you get from military base, even though they're horrendous because of what they're doing. Like one of the places I was at was Fort Benning, and it's called the School of the Americas, and the other people called it what it was, the School of Assassins. It's where you went to get trained to be a death squad in Latin America. But at least it wasn't me, I was a kid. At least there was an honesty in the military. They knew what they were doing. They were controlling arenas and they were killing for empire. They didn't pretend they were doing anything else, right? And so I was raised by an intelligence officer who was in Korea, Philippines, Vietnam, whatever, and also in Detroit, to put down a rebellion that the National Guard couldn't put down because black radicals that I'm referencing were so good at what they were doing. First, the police tried to stop the rebellion, I believe it was in 1967. Then you have to get the National Guard. They couldn't stop it, so they had to go to the 101st Airborne and bring them in. So there are these moments when there are going to be flare-ups. My question would be, what is it that we need to have consistency and struggle? So it's a repetitive query, but it's the only one really that I have to offer in the moment. So back to Butler. Butler says at one point, she's like opening a portal. I want everybody to see themselves as a possible mutation because her protagonists aren't pretty. Like if you kindred, there's something always going on in terms of violence. But they survive. They mutate, but they survive. So Butler also shares what it's like to be one of the first black women to write sci-fi, and she gets a MacArthur for it. When she starts, she's selling her books out of the trunk of her car in Berkeley. And by, a decade or so in, she's famous. She becomes like a version of what Toni Morrison will be, right? But what she also says is when she goes to these sci-fi conferences, She notices the absence of blackness, absence of any discourse of black people as having a different experience in reality and a different proximity to violence than people who are not black. Indigenous people, I would say, we're kind of connected. And when she raised that at a panel, she's like, why don't you ever talk about black personas or have them in your science fiction? They said, the response that she said was given to her was, it's because we already have aliens. So if you understand what they just said, then, oh yeah, that makes sense that the third world gets decimated. It's filled with aliens. I mean, aliens are what you go to war, you know, all those movies, those Hollywood movies from, you know, whatever they are, I blocked them out. But this, what you save is you save humans. What you defeat is you defeat aliens. Once you equate the black with the alien, then you understand the trajectory of the United States over centuries. And you can't pretend that there's any other trajectory. And if the way out is to become a comprador and be a black face on a war machine, then what you're facing is what Sophia Bukhari said when she came to Brown. Sophia was in the Black Panther Party in New York City, went underground with the Republic of New Africa, was captured, imprisoned for 8 years, had a forced hysterectomy, because they torture you when you're inside too, came out, and a number of years after being released, she transitioned. She died prematurely. And Laura Whitehorn, who's white, in the Weather Underground, when she told me that Safia, I go Safia and Sophia, but it's Safia, that Safia had died, she said she died from grief. So there's a way in which our vulnerability is always front and center, but there's a way in which our resistance is also front and center. So again, what Sophia said, the state will kill you and the civilians will kill you. So you're between a rock and a hard place. So what does it mean that you cannot trust huge swaths or sectors of the state? Like when Huey starts hunting the Revolutionary Panthers, the police stop bugging Huey. He's not a problem. Because what he's doing is just regular crime, and he's also doing some work that the police would have had to do for themselves. I am only interested, and maybe I'm a bad person, don't give a damn. I am only interested in the longevity of the revolutionary at this point. Every child should be fed and raised, and that's important, and I make donations to that. But my focus is on the political prisoners who are still incarcerated, on the people who are going to be imprisoned around, they're facing terrorism charges around Cop City. There's a Georgia state trooper shot environmentalist Venezuelan, Tortuguita, 57 times. Tortuguita was unarmed, they were sitting, and their hands were raised. This is about building a militarized police zone in Atlanta. The troopers were exonerated that it was justifiable homicide. And so when I go to Atlanta and I'm talking to the forest protectors who knew Tortuguita after they died, and I'm asking them about their security perimeter or how they take care of themselves, they can't articulate any defense. And I would think that to build a utopian society, you would have to defend it. So why is there such paltry language about defense? And defense doesn't mean you have to be a militarist. It could be the churches, the mosques, the synagogues, they're all protecting us. They'll come out and march if the police try to shoot. You know, it could be anything, but there seems to be a gap. So moving on, because I know I'm ad-libbing a little, and so I want to get to a close so we can talk. I would say that some of the best gifts that come out of Octavia Butler is that she doesn't give us closure, and she doesn't really give us answers. She gives us a narrative of struggle. So even if it's the piece between Doro and Mary, where Doro is immortal, and Mary turns out to be his daughter who's immortal too, and she has to eliminate her father because he's predatory as a deity. Mary manages to do it, and a lot of the community suffers or disappears or dies in the battle, but the battle is inevitable. And so I wonder if we escape through sci-fi, if we escape through poetry, if we escape through novels, if we escape through blah-dia, 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 I wonder if we can recalibrate and find ourselves again. It's kind of like Hansel and Gretel. Like you could lose the bread trail, but maybe there's another trace or trail that's been left for us in terms of the people over the decades who have fought and the people who understand that these wars have never ended. They've ended for certain sectors and certain peoples, but other people remain haunted. And I would like to think that the artists who can talk about or write about or paint about or envision an abduction but never agree to the terms of engagement set by the eagle, set by the empire, I would like to think that art will become one of the ways in which we can sustain ourselves and move from protest, which comes after caretaking, and which will be followed by movement, into marronage, and marronage will be met by war if autonomy is prohibited. But we would feel, and we would figure out a way to tunnel under or to crawl above a wall in order to find sanctuary. And if we don't get utopia, that's fine with me. So thank you.
Really looking forward to the discussion. Who'd like to start?
Oh, we have free bookmarks.
They've been circulating, but they might not make it to the sides.
There's a QR code that opens like a whole encyclopedia if you just want to learn more or share more with your students and communities. Surely you don't want me to keep talking.
Thank you so much for that. I'm just interested in what you said about defense and needing to defend utopia. And if we're thinking outside of the realm of militarism, but you talked about, evoked religion, I'm wondering what other kinds of defense are available to us. I don't know if you're familiar with Adrienne Marie Brown, who talks a lot about Octavia Butler as well, who's really leaning into spells at the minute. I wonder if you think that's a resource or what other resources are available.
What did you say before, Adrienne Brown? What resources?
Well, she talks about spells.
Spells?
Yeah, spells.
Yeah.
And
that makes sense. Like a couple of weeks ago, I was in Los Angeles. I don't know if you know No Name. I mean, the younger people might. Yeah. I didn't know until younger people told me what was going on. So that's a rapper and who has a bookstore, and it turns out her mother had a bookstore or has one in Chicago. And so just meeting with them, I got to see, these different generations, right? And how they see text and how they see literature and how they talk about dreamscape and sci-fi and things like that. And I think it's very important. I think what I'm doing is adjacent to and supportive of that, but I think it's a bit different. Because probably, maybe, whatever, I'm trained as a political scientist and a political philosopher, so the material struggle is very important to me. And I appreciate literature and text, but there's something else that I'm looking for. And because I also go into prisons and I meet with political prisoners, and I can walk out after 4 hours, they cannot. I think the contradictions, like, you know, I'm bougie, I'm middle class, so people find other contradictions, like, can't feed my kids, I'm living in substandard housing. There's always these contradictions that create a friction between the stability of your internal monologue or narrative. And sometimes you have to go into a zone, if you're like comfortable, you have to go in another zone to get it, that tranquility is probably superficial, right? So I'll just be candid, I don't trust much that comes out of literature unless it's connected to material struggle. And that may sound like I'm just gonna be boorish and really like blinders, but again, I grew up like reading for decades, and books were my solace, you know, especially if you're in military, like you wanna get away from them, you go read a book, right? But in the United States, there is a way in which our literature is turned into a commodity, and our sense of care and caregiving has also been monetized. And so I don't know when we read the same literature if we're seeing the same thing. That, I don't know if that sounds really vague. So I've been critiquing the academic left in the last couple of books. Part of it is that up to $1 billion flooded in after people were killed by the police. They also noted the people killed by the police were poor and working class. The people who got the $1 billion in distributions were not poor and working class. So the United States knows how to monetize Black death. And this is, again, when you don't have a second world to go to, and you're not going to go to the ground and be with poor people or go into the prisons, then you're going to align with the elites. That's the only sector that's left. There is this middle class, but the middle class kind of jockeys for a public platform, for publications, for visibility, for being interviewed, et cetera, et cetera. And I know those things actually happen to me as well, but that's in the left zone. I'm not going to be in the liberal anymore since I kind of cut ties. And I'm sure people would say they're not liberal, they're radical, but then that for me is my point. You can't even define what is radical in the United States anymore. Because it's radical and it's coming out of a $100 million coffer to teach people how to be radical or how to be anti-racist. And Daruba bin Wahad, who did 18, 19 years, he was framed, so they had to give him like 1 or 2 mil, I don't know. But he's been one of the few people who will openly critique accumulations by left academics who control the narrative. Because even the Panthers are not going to come up and say, you're actually manipulating our narrative and our legacy. They're not going to, what's the cost? What's the benefit? Most people are broke. They've been in prison for decades. They're going to die prematurely. They were tortured inside, so they have all these ailments. Why would they pick, you know, an argument with Black elites who control the narrative? I mean, it'd be logical that you just wait and see if some of that money could be dispersed more evenly among non-elites. This is the thing that really kind of like, I wouldn't say it made me bitter. It just like, I found it exhausting. How do you monetize Black death so that the spectacle of public lynching, like George Floyd, that was a spectacle. 8 minutes is really long, right? And people are crying and they're yelling. And I go to a conference a month or two ago, and the title of one segment is "Somebody Throw a Cell Phone." Nobody had it within them to quell their fear to approach Derek Chauvin so that he wouldn't do a murder in front of them. So now they have to live with that for the rest of their lives. But, you know, George Floyd doesn't give it life, right? But out of that, all this money floods in, and none of it goes to poor people or working class people who are most likely to be attacked by the police. So how do you get a revenue stream like that unless it's a purchase? It's a purchase of radicalism. Our movements, what they can't shoot up they bought. And I talk about in the US, but you could talk, Chris Hani is the only person, according to Frank Waller's and their other sources, if you read his memoir, Incognito, Chris Hani is the only person who could have defeated Nelson Mandela in an election. Chris Hani gets assassinated in '93. That is a black communist who said you have to give the land back to the people and the money. You can't just do liberal capitalism. And then you see the poverty today, you see the violence today. I mean, yeah, that is a larger plan. So when these texts and these publications come out, I just sort of want to know how is the text undermining the plan? And if I don't have deep enough sensibilities to figure that out, that's fine. I have limitations. But I also believe that most writers stay in a liberal corridor that is comfortable and safe. Like the FBI is not going to be looking for you if you talk about care in one way. If you start talking about care like they need to stop shooting us and we need to mobilize, you will get on the black extremist list, or whatever, identity extremist list. Most academics don't want to be on a list like, you want to be on the dean's list, right? You want to like go have lunch with the chancellor or something like that. You don't want to be pegged by the state. But the state doesn't have to worry if black people are managing other black people, right? That's the whole talented 10th role. Like W.B. Du Bois publishes in 1903, The Soul of Black Folks. It like goes everywhere. He's one of the first PhDs from Harvard, black intellectual. But Spelman is named after the prestigious women's school, is named after Laura Spelman, who's a Rockefeller. And Morehouse, which has invited Joe Biden to be their commencement speaker. So that could probably turn into be a riot. And the same Georgia troopers who shot environmentalists 57 times may be out like on the street protecting the president. So I don't know how the students are going to deal with that and who thought that was a good idea. But Morehouse is named after Henry Morehouse, who's a white philanthropist. The idea was to create a talented 10th that would manage the 90%. Because after the Civil War, we were sold as Trojan horse, which was a 13th Amendment, which says that slavery is illegal in the United States unless you've been duly convicted of a crime. So they figure out who the criminal or criminalized population is. So after the war, especially after Reconstruction, they pulled out the federal troops. Black people died at faster rates than we had on plantations because we belonged to the state and corporation. So they just worked us to death. And I say we because I don't believe in time and space in the conventional way. So if you can get constant Trojan horses out of a democracy, and people realize that, maybe they're a group of people who just want to be safe. And it's safe in the enclosure, it's safe in the nonprofit, it's safe in the elite academy, as long as you don't protest with the students. And so our fear is greater than our desire. And our texts often, I believe, reflect our fear more than our desire to move up stages towards confrontation. That's a long way, don't know if it helped.
Who's next?
Thanks a lot, Joy. Could you say a bit more about what modern-day marronage looks like? And perhaps also, I don't know how much it's connected, but what is the importance of relationships in current forms of resistance and utopia building, maybe?
Yeah, the relationships are key. But, you know, if you've ever grown up with military people or revolutionary people, they all have PTSD. So maintaining relationships with them, like when they lose their temper, when they're exhausted, when they just, you know, start going mute, when they disappear, when, you know, they're doing drugs or they're drinking too much, it's a stressor. So I don't know what keeps us together. because I know people who can get out, they go work for the government, or they go work for the state or whatever. But from what I've seen, there's a loyalty even when harm inside the circle happens. I mean, if it's Huey's kind of stuff, no, because, and to be honest, once Huey sent death squads, the East Coast started trying to kill his people too. I think it's risk-taking, like other forms of loving. It's just, you're just gonna have a high-risk lover. And it doesn't, I'm not talking about romance or sexual necessarily, but it's like, you get a kid or you get an elder and they have, medical complications, whatever, or they decide they wanna do underground economies and you have to like bail them out or go visit them in prison. I mean, it's part of fidelity. And I think that's why I was drawn to agape, because it's different forms of love, but it's not erotic, it's not familial, it's not comradely. This is a devotion that is disciplined. So even when you want to leave, you stay. Now, you shouldn't stay and be abused, right? I mean, there's other cadres to work with. But what is our tolerance for dysfunction and grief? I have no idea until I just go down the road, and then I figure it out. And then having respite would be nice, like take a break and then come back. But I've met people, maybe that's why Sophia died so young. I've met people who don't take a break. I mean, like they're soldiers, they're literally soldiers, right? And they see themselves as protectors. And so what they were trying to do is change the world so that their children and their grandchildren wouldn't be shot down in the street or have somebody put a knee on their neck for 8 minutes. And I also think on some level, I'm speculating because they also don't talk very much. Like people who go to war don't talk much. That's my experience. You might have a different one. Sometimes you just have to trust them because they're not going to articulate their moods. Like, this is how I feel, right? They don't have those therapeutic modality speech. I find it rare. Most people are reticent. They don't talk about what they did in the war. They don't talk about who tortured them in prison. They don't talk about their ailments. They don't talk about the fact they have cancer. When we had like heart surgery a couple of times, and they were happy to like let them just substandard surgeons. Like if you take them out, then we don't have to deal with it. So it's like you have to understand the language of mute. You have to understand the language of silence. And again, for me, if I can understand context, then even if I'm wrong, I can kind of speculate what goes on. And then when I verbalize it, it's like, he's like, that's not what I said. And that's not how I feel. And you, okay, why don't you stop trying to, anticipate my feeling? And I was like, okay, fine, whatever. But there's this moment that if you don't give up and then you have patience and you understand this is the long road. Like there is nothing that will change rapidly in the United States for the good. It will definitely swerve towards the proto-fascists fairly quickly. And the white nationalists have gone in the military and they've been trained for free, and then they can go into police forces and they're being militarized too. And then you know that we have more guns than any country in the world. More guns than you could possibly fire, but that's because the plan, I'm told, is to balkanize the U.S. and the white nationalists will get their Texas and Florida and sectors of the South, and no abortion, even if the mother dies, even if it's incest, even if it's rape. It's just rape. It's going to be authoritarian sectors. And when Obama left, he did not put anybody in the Supreme Court, so Trump put ultra-reactionaries in the Supreme Court. So there's nothing, all the branches of legal, executive, judiciary, and the House, those are all centrist to right wing. And just because you have like Ocasio-Cortez, you have these like little pockets, they're afraid that they're going to be primaried because AIPAC said they were going to primary them. So everything that should work in a democracy is dysfunctional. And so it's like, what do we want to do with our imaginations? And how do we want to use those imaginations to materialize and protect maroon camps and autonomy? So that's where I'm going to maroon camp. In terms of like getting a file, I mean, I'm just sharing. They can reactivate my old one from when I was going to those countries, right? But the thing that I see is the beauty of it is when younger people can meet with older people and I watch them have a conversation. But I'm finding the academy is like creating a barrier. Because if the language is freedom dreams, I've been at like the picture I showed you when we were in Houston, Sekou Odinga was saying that it belonged to the youth now, the struggle, and there's nothing else he could do. And he did 33 years. He, with Silvio Berardini, who's back in Italy, but she had to do 20 years in prison in the United States, which is the worst, there are the worst prisons, whatever. Sekou did 33. Those two broke Assata Shakur out. It was completely clean. Nobody was hurt or injured. But Sekou was tortured for decades, and when he got out, he transitioned a couple months ago. When he got out, we were at this forum against the death penalty in Texas, and young people stood up and started saying, why don't you share our freedom dreams? And I was like, wait, I understand that language. That comes from the academy. That's in the abolitionist books. And it's very vague, and I'm like, which freedom, what does that mean? And they were almost like chastising him. And so I just raised the question, would you rather have devotion from your elders or for them to share the same dreamscape? Because the dreamscape is like you're reading Octavia Butler, that's cool. But that isn't, like it doesn't stop a bullet. So what reality do you want to be in? And I believe that in the Lead Academy, the young people are trained as elites to manage the narrative that they could chastise somebody who did 33 years in prison, who liberated Assata, and you're like, I'm Assata's daughter, Assata's taught me, or something. Like, you're using Shakur, who you can't meet her because they upped the bounty to 2 million, and that was under the Obama administration. So our contradictions are deep. Like, that happens, and then we're still told to vote for Obama in the second term, and then vote for Hillary, and then vote for Joe Biden. We're told to stay on the ranch. And because we have resources, we can do that and live to an old age. But then you have to watch other people disappear. And that's not tenable for some. So the youth are mobilized to be professional radicals who control the narrative so that someone like Sekou, when he says, this is what it's like. I mean, he didn't even have to come back to the US. He was in Algiers. He could have just stayed there, right? But he came back, and he's like, we can figure something out, nobody will get hurt, and she doesn't have to die in prison. And they pulled it off. But you can't even acknowledge that because it goes against the narrative of freedom dreams and on an abstract level. What if your freedom dream is that you have the right to self-defense? Nobody in the academy is going to say that out loud. So then what do you do with the people who say you have a right to self-defense and we're trying to keep you alive, so we're going to do what you refuse to do for yourself, right? I think that's a horrible equation for a relationship. I feel like we pimp the radicals, the real radicals, not the rhetorical radicals. So as you know, I'm not popular in academia anymore. But here's the deal. I think everybody figures out who and what they love, and then they're faithful to that. I've been fortunate, like I grew up with really like conservative people who were like, doing empire stuff. But then I met other people, and I love those people too, but I met other people who as teenagers, like the people I know, like 12, 13, 14, 15, that's when they went into the Panthers. And you can say, what were their parents doing? Obviously not monitoring, right? But what they wanted to do was change the world by loving it. And when I listen to them, they all say the same thing. They didn't think they were going to live past age 17. So they were going to go full throttle for freedom. You know another group that says that? Really low-income people in gangs. Like the teenagers think, we're going to be dead anyway, so let's just do it. So one is for accumulation, right, in the underground economy. The other is like, we're going to free our people and work with indigenous people, Puerto Ricanos, everybody. And there's a beauty in that, even though it's terrifying to the parent. And, you know, because of what the state will do. And the state has proven that it will eliminate problems. And they don't care how old you are.
Next question.
Thank you very much. That was a great talk. And I would like to ask you a question about the relationship between the state and the revolution, what it used to be and what it maybe could be.
Yeah.
And I think if we think about the history of revolution, we come to these different patterns which all haven't really produced very good outcomes. You know, the violent revolutionary movements taking over the state, then actually becoming the state themselves, making the state stronger, but being no less authoritarian, just in a different way. Then we have, nowadays, we have these non-violent revolutions or attempted revolutions. They find the state so problematic after all these rounds of revolutions and counter-revolutions, every one of which made the state stronger, that they just want to stay away from it. And then they basically get killed by the state, or the movement gets killed by the state, because that doesn't work either. And in between is maybe this moment of what Adam Getachew called world making, where new elites got handed a state, and they, like Kwame Nkrumah, and they were really thinking about how can we think beyond the state? How can we invent something else? And they never came up with anything but federation, which then didn't work either in those cases. So I was wondering whether you have some sort of additional thoughts, what could be put in this place of world making? Like what would, you know, how can we not ignore the state, but also not take it over and make it even stronger? Like what else could be there as a solution for the revolution?
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, obviously, I don't have a solution. I think that's probably why I went through stages, that we approach an endeavor, and to the extent that we can carry out an act, that we do so. And that could be creating a book club. It could be feeding people, right? It could be allowing people to leave these nonprofits where most of them are not unionized, even though they stand for Black Lives Matter. It's like they're not unionized. So that means if you don't stay on script with the narrative of the politics, you can lose your nonprofit job, right? So I probably write and anthologize and talk like with a big umbrella, but the way I function on the ground is really with a kind of particular support and intimacy with different folks. So like when we worked on Kevin Johnson, who was going to be executed in Missouri, when he was 19, his 12-year-old brother collapsed when the police were doing a raid at his house, and he was next door, and they stepped over his body, and it felt like he didn't get the 12-year-old medical attention. And when the mother came, you know, to try to, you know, retrieve her 12-year-old off the floor in the hall, the police pushed her out because they were doing a raid, and so the 12-year-old died. And so when Kevin came out later that night and he had a gun, he was just going to shoot any police officer he could find, and he did. And so he was on death row for a number of years or decades, and we were asked to work on the case to bring attention to it. So we ended up interviewing him on a podcast, talking to him and everything. And then I'm organizing something on campus with Frank Wilderson and everybody, and I'm trying to talk about Afro-pessimism, but we also need to, just the nitty-gritty, we have big ideas, but let's just save Kevin's life, because he's going to be executed in like 3 or 4 days. And we, you know, obviously we didn't pull it off because the U.S. is the U.S. There wasn't any state of execution. So in that moment, I saw us collectively, there was about 4 of us, we listened to the hearings, we would talk to Kevin. we did everything we could to save a life, but we were unable to save that life. But that didn't stop us from moving to the next. And it may be like, well, there's like millions of people, you can't do it one by one by one. But what we were trying to do is make an individual intervention, but have a narrative. And if the narrative could tie us together as a larger community, like you need to ban the death penalty in the United States, then the possibility of sanctuary increases. If you can't stop state violence, your sanctuaries will be burnt to the ground. So you could pick something really small and throw everything into it. And I remember too, I didn't even do self-care, because like on the phone with everybody, I said, turn off your phones and take care of yourself, lavender bath and just go to sleep. He died, but you know, we'll move on there. And so at 2 in the morning, I'm freaking out and I'm calling everybody, but I already told them to turn off their phones. So I just have to ride by myself, right? So there has to be a balance of your longevity and struggle with the collective. And sometimes you could read your needs. Obviously, I misread mine at that time. That is the way I see it until something else gets off the ground. I don't know what other formation is coming down the pike, but something's coming down the pike. I would like to believe that the longevity of the revolutionaries is imperative. Now, it would be good if you don't end up going to prison because you're supporting them or hiding them, but I think it's necessary that they receive some type of support. So that's how I was talking about the epicenter, the surface of politics, where bell hooks would be, right? Saying all the right things about gender, and they're important things. She got the Central Park case completely wrong because I organized on it. I talk about that in New Bones Abolition. But at the hypo, down to ground zero, that is where the people, like even if you, some of them, if you told them not to do the act, they were gonna do it anyway. And it wasn't just black people, like Marilyn Buck was a white radical, she was helpful. The state, nobody again gets hurt. She got shot in the leg when they arrested her. I anthologized her, right, wrote to her. They released her from prison 2 weeks before she died from cancer. The state is performative. It's like if you even think to rebel, this is the cost to your family, to your neighbors, you know, to life itself. And so I think it's that level of intimidation is what keeps our creativity really subdued. And I'm not even saying about doing anything illegal. I actually think in the US, we're having cognitive dissonance. Like, it is so difficult to think clearly beyond a rhetorical text that your publisher will edit and then like just put it out on blast and then you can sign book. You know, this book, the proceeds go to prison radio, so forget what I just said if you're thinking about donation stuff. I don't have, because I'm old enough at this stage, I don't have any expectations of an easy win at anything. But I'm quite composed, as long as I don't, don't get arrested, but whatever. I'm quite composed and at peace with the fact that I've aligned myself with the rebels. And to the extent that I work for a multi-billionaire club, which is also called a college, I have a level, when I go somewhere, it's like if something happens, you have to come get me, right? I have a level of protection, which means I could misgauge and it's probably maybe smaller than I thought, but I'm not freaked out about it. And I think that came over decades. I don't think some of the young people, they're there from jump start. It took me decades. But I would also say growing up on military bases and growing up shooting and being in an ROTC normalized violence for me completely. I was like, oh, this is just how the world works. So I don't have to engage in the narratives that I hear in bourgeois academia as if you can win a fight without being in a fight. That this is all rhetorical and one day the democracy is going to change and love indigenous people and black people and poor people and radical people. You know, I don't believe in freedom dreams. I believe in freedom. It's two different things.
I can just use my voice.
Since it's recorded.
Oh, right. Okay, sure. Sorry, I have a scent allergy, so when you hear me coughing, it usually means I got hit. I can't even say how pleased I am for this to have been organized. Joy, I have a small intro and a question for you, because we're about to wrap up. Very interesting. I was in Aberdeen, and I made it just in time for this series called Granite Harbor, which has a lead of a young Jamaican man who went through the British military and now wants to become a detective on the special program. Beautiful actor, Romario Simpson. I only met him for the first time. But he also played in Andor, in that entire prison scene. He was the black man that is working with the main character to figure out how to disrupt the system. He was in 3 episodes, and I was like, we could have so easily let him continue on, but of course he's killed right at the beginning, right? So my question for you to wrap up here, and thank you, Octavia's stuff, Blood Child, and how she writes is a major one for me beyond the series. But my question for you is either one. Could you talk about the primer on Wakanda, or, oh my God, I've forgotten what the other one is. But I would ask you if you could, if you wanted to speak to that a little bit, because that so took over the imagination. Oh, or Engage, because for me, which is going to be coming out in Pluto, I looked it up and there's no description. But because I do Black and Indigenous relations, and thank you, I'm so often hearing this discussion about the erotics, and I'm like, I don't want to hear about mixed race. I don't want to hear about these romantic ideas, the daughters of the dust, the indigenous man riding off with the... I'm talking about being a good neighbor. In Jamaica, we have a saying, good neighbor better than money, meaning your good neighbor is key to your sense of well-being. So could you either talk about Engage, or could you talk about the primer for Wakanda, because they're both tied to the solidarity struggle that I just seen has been messed up with melon money. There's so many things that have been just messed with the deliverance of melon money, and watching these projects just falter. They never happened,
I see you went there.
I did go there,
Yeah.
and I will go there. I know you know which projects I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in this kind of moving forward future, either speaking out either one. I mean, Wakanda forever is an abomination to me. I wept, I cried a lot. I was sick I was actually physically sick for 2 days because I didn't know how Olokun was not, I couldn't understand how Hurricane and Olokun did not meet in that movie. It was an absolute abomination for me on a spirit level. And of course supported the CIA again. So I just was gone. Could you, if you wouldn't mind? And thank you for being here.
Thank you for that. I did an article in Southern Cal Library. What was it? Killmonger's captive maternal is MIA. Because I was struck by the absence of his parents, right, and that he was rogue. And he was a mercenary. But then you had the prince, to balance against him, right? So there was nobility, and I decided I would see the movie. This is